The Atlantic winds carried more than trade. They carried the cries of millions. Across the vast, merciless ocean, a human tide was torn from its roots, chained, and sold to build a new world. This is the story of American slave culture. A story not only of bondage, but of survival, identity, and an unbroken spirit. The year was 1619. A ship named the White Lion anchored off the coast of Virginia. On board were about 20 Africans, stolen from a Portuguese slave vessel. They were traded for supplies. That single transaction would mark the beginning of over 2 centuries of human bondage in what would become the United States. But the roots of this story reach deeper, across the Atlantic, into the kingdoms of West Africa. There, before the chains, people lived in complex societies, the Ashanti, Yoruba, Mandinka, and many others, with kings, artisans, farmers, and warriors. They had their own languages, music, gods, and traditions. They were not slaves. They were human beings with histories that would be violently uprooted. European traders, hungry for labor to fuel their colonies, turned the African body into currency. Ships filled with guns, rum, and goods crossed to African shores. In exchange, millions of lives were taken. The Middle Passage, a voyage of terror lasting weeks, sometimes months, became a floating graveyard. Men and women were chained together in darkness, packed tighter than cargo, starved, beaten, and dehumanized. Some jumped into the sea, choosing death over bondage. Others prayed in whispers, calling upon ancestors and spirits to carry their souls home. Those who survived reached a strange land, where their names, languages, and gods were stripped away. Auction blocks replaced their villages. Whips replaced their songs. And yet, even as their captors sought to erase them, something unbreakable endured. On the plantations of Virginia, South Carolina, and later Louisiana and Mississippi, African captives began to build a new identity. They came from different tribes, spoke different tongues, worshipped different deities. But in the fields, under the sun, in suffering, they began to weave their pain into a shared fabric. This was the birth of an African-American culture. They learned to communicate through rhythm, tapping hands, stamping feet, humming low chants when words were forbidden. They found fragments of their old gods hidden in Christian hymns. They found family among strangers. They found ways to live, even when living was not allowed. As the colonies grew, so did the slave system. By the 1700s, enslaved Africans were the backbone of America's economy, planting tobacco, cotton, and sugar that fueled the wealth of empires. Their labor built the grand houses of the South, the ships of the North, and the very foundation of American prosperity. But this prosperity came at an unimaginable cost: generations of stolen lives. In the eyes of their masters, slaves were property, but among themselves, they were a people. They remembered old names in secret. They celebrated births, mourned deaths, told stories of Anansi the spider, a trickster who outsmarted stronger foes. In Anansi's tales, slaves found hope, proof that even the powerless could win through wit and spirit. But freedom was not yet in sight. The chains grew tighter, the laws harsher. Children were sold away from mothers. Men were whipped until their backs became maps of pain. Women endured violence unspeakable, yet still nursed their children and sang them lullabies of distant homelands. Every night, when the fields fell silent and the stars appeared above the slave quarters, a quiet world came alive. Songs rose from the darkness. Feet tapped against dirt floors. Whispers turned into prayers. And in those moments, for a heartbeat, they were free again. As the 18th century moved forward, the rebellion grew quieter, stronger, and more complex. Families, faith, and art began to form the invisible structure that kept millions alive. This was more than survival. It was a cultural revolution happening in silence. The sun rises over the fields. A whip cracks, voices murmur, and another day begins, on land that never belonged to those who work it. For the enslaved, dawn was not a beginning, it was a reminder. A reminder that life was measured not in dreams, but in orders. The plantation was a world unto itself, a machine of human labor built on pain and routine. Men, women, and children were divided by skill and strength. Some worked the cotton and sugar fields, their hands bleeding from thorns and cane. Others worked in the big house, cooking, cleaning, nursing the children of their masters. But whether in the house or the field, no one escaped the chain of ownership. The overseer, the enforcer of order, carried a whip like a shadow. It spoke louder than any word. A crack meant punishment. A pause meant fear. Yet even under his watchful eyes, the enslaved learned to communicate in silence. A nod, a hum, a verse, everything had meaning. And when words were too dangerous, songs carried the truth. Work songs rose with the rhythm of the hoe, call and response, echoing across the fields. A leader would sing a line, a story, a complaint, a coded prayer, and others would answer, keeping time, keeping hope alive. Music wasn't entertainment. It was survival. It gave the body rhythm and the mind freedom. It was how the enslaved kept their humanity intact. In the quarters, after the day's labor, a different world emerged. Small cabins built of rough timber, smoky from the hearth. Children played in the dirt. Women prepared food, cornmeal, beans, bits of pork or greens. They made do with what was left to them. And somehow, out of scraps, they created a cuisine that would one day define the American South. But family life was fragile. At any moment, a knock on the door could mean separation. Children sold, husbands sent away, wives traded like property. Mothers taught their children to be cautious, to bow their heads, to answer softly. But in their lullabies, they wove secret messages of pride. You are more than what they call you. You are the child of kings. Faith was another refuge. Christianity, imposed by the masters, became transformed by those it sought to control. The enslaved heard of Moses, who led his people out of Egypt, and they saw themselves in that story. They sang of crossing the Jordan, of a promised land, of a God who would one day set them free. The invisible church was born, secret gatherings in the woods, away from watchful eyes. There, under the stars, they sang, shouted, and prayed with fire. They found in religion not submission, but rebellion. They spoke of freedom not just in heaven, but on earth. Day after day, year after year, the enslaved endured. Their labor built empires. Their songs built identity. Their culture, born from pain, became the heartbeat of a nation. The plantation owners believed they had stripped them of everything. Language, history, freedom. But they could not strip away imagination. Inside the slave quarters, dreams lived. Dreams of escape. Dreams of reunion. Dreams of a land where the whip did not sound. In whispered tones, stories of the North, of freedom, spread like wildfire. Some risked everything to follow those stories. Through forests, swamps, and rivers, guided by the stars, by faith, and by songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper, its handle pointing north. A coded map in song form, passed from one enslaved person to another. Even music became a compass. But for those who stayed, resistance took other forms, quiet and clever. Breaking tools, working slow, feigned illness, small acts that defied the system. Each one was a spark, invisible but real. On Sundays, when masters allowed rest, enslaved people gathered, sometimes mixing with free blacks and poor whites. Markets bustled with crafts, food, and gossip. There was laughter, even joy, because joy itself was resistance. To smile, to love, to dance, was to say, "You have not broken me." They created new music, blending African rhythms with European melodies. From that fusion would come spirituals, gospel, blues, and eventually jazz, a cultural lineage born in the fields of pain. By the early 1800s, generations had lived and died in bondage. America's wealth had grown vast, and so had the cruelty of its system. But the enslaved had built something the world could not ignore: a living, breathing culture of resistance, faith, and community. They had taken the tools of oppression, Christianity, language, labor, and reshaped them into tools of endurance. In their hearts, they carried both Africa and America, a dual identity forged by fire. And as whispers of abolition began to stir, that culture, forged in silence, would become a weapon. Because culture is not just music or faith, it's memory, and memory can start a revolution. For centuries, enslaved Africans were told they were powerless. That obedience was salvation. That resistance meant death. But within the rhythm of their songs, within the whispers at night, the idea of freedom grew like a heartbeat, unstoppable. Every generation had its resistors. Some fought with fire, some fought with faith, some fought simply by surviving, refusing to let the system erase their humanity. Then there were the rebels who dared to rise openly. names that would echo through time. Gabriel Prosser, a blacksmith from Virginia. In 1800, he planned one of the first large slave uprisings in American history. 1,000 men were ready to take Richmond, but a storm and betrayal stopped them before the first strike. Gabriel was captured and hanged, but his dream did not die. It spread, carried by whispers and memory. Then came Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter from Charleston, South Carolina. In 1822, he organized what would have been the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, a plan to seize the city and sail to Haiti, where black freedom had already triumphed. He was betrayed before the first move. He too was executed, along with 34 others. But his words remained, "We have as much right to be free as any man." And then, the storm that could not be contained, Nat Turner, a preacher from Virginia, who saw visions of angels and believed God had chosen him to end slavery with blood. In August of 1831, Nat and his followers rose in the night, killing dozens of slaveholders. For 48 hours, fear swept across the South. When the revolt was crushed, Turner was captured and executed. But his rebellion sent shockwaves through America. The South tightened its laws. The North's abolitionist fire grew stronger. Nat Turner had turned faith into revolution. And among its most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman, a woman so fearless they called her Moses. Born into slavery, beaten and scarred, she escaped to freedom in 1849. But freedom wasn't enough. She went back, again and again, nearly 20 times, leading over 300 people to safety. She carried a pistol, not out of cruelty, but conviction. "If you hear the dogs, keep going," she said. "If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." Her story became legend, proof that a single person's courage could change history. Women, too, led their own forms of rebellion. Some poisoned their master's food. Some hid fugitives in their quarters. Some refused to bear children into slavery, an act of despair, but also defiance. And then there were rebellions that went beyond individuals. Entire communities of escaped slaves, called Maroons, lived in remote swamps and forests. They built villages in places no white man dared to go. In Florida, the Seminole Indians sheltered runaway slaves, fighting side by side against U.S. troops. In Louisiana's swamps, free black settlements thrived for generations. Outlaws to the state, but free in their own eyes. Each act of resistance, small or large, added to a growing current. Men like Frederick Douglass, who escaped from Maryland and became the voice of the movement. He said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." His speeches carried the fire of every man and woman still in chains. As the nation expanded westward, the question of slavery became a storm no one could contain. Every law, every compromise, every debate in Congress was a struggle over the humanity of millions. When a civil war erupted in 1861, enslaved people didn't wait for freedom to be given. They seized it. I have made dedicated video on America's Civil War. Link will be in description. Go and check it out. Back to the video. Thousands fled plantations, joining Union lines, offering their labor, their knowledge, their lives. They became soldiers, scouts, nurses, fighting not for a nation that had enslaved them, but for a future that might finally see them as human. In 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was a legal act to abolish slave culture. In 1865, when Union troops reached Texas and declared the enslaved free, the last corner of bondage was broken. The cheers, the tears, the songs that filled the air that day became the first Juneteenth. But freedom was only the beginning of a new struggle. To live, to belong, to be seen as human. Freedom came like a sunrise, slow, uncertain, and blinding. For 4 million souls, the chains had fallen. The Civil War had ended. But the war for equality had only just begun. American slave culture did not vanish with emancipation. It transformed into the heartbeat of modern America. The songs of the fields became the roots of gospel. The rhythm of the work chants became the blues. The blues gave birth to jazz, to soul, to rock and roll. And through every beat, every note, the spirit of survival spoke again. The invisible church became the black church, a place of worship, yes, but also of resistance, hope, and community. Their food, the humble meals once made from scraps, became celebration. Collard greens, okra, black-eyed peas, cornbread, dishes born from necessity, transformed into symbols of identity. The hymns of the plantations turned into protest songs. "We Shall Overcome" was more than melody, it was history singing through new voices. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Toni Morrison gave words to what had been whispered in cabins and fields. Pain became literature. Memory became identity. They told the world, "We are still here." Their legacy lives not just in museums or history books, but in the everyday life of a nation that was built upon their backs and shaped by their brilliance. The way Americans sing, cook, pray, and dream all carry traces of the slave quarters, the fields, the spirituals, even the concept of freedom itself. The story of American slave culture is not just about pain. It's about transformation, about people who, stripped of everything, built something eternal. They created art from anguish, faith from despair, and community from chaos. Their story is not over. It lives in us, in every rhythm, every prayer, every act of resilience. And as long as their songs are sung, as long as their legacy is remembered, the spirit of freedom they carried will never fade.